When a family's hidden truths come crashing down in a single, shattering day. A day when a young voice dares to reveal the dark secrets that have held them captive. A world once built on trust and love begins to crumble. When a father's clandestine life of crime forces his 15-year-old son to speak out, everything is thrown into chaos, and the battle for redemption, forgiveness, and a second chance begins. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of truth and the strength to rebuild, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Matthew always hated being the center of attention, especially in a place as intimidating as a courtroom. At just 15 years old, he felt like a child lost in a maze of solemn faces, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took in the rows of silent strangers. They were all watching him, judges, lawyers, onlookers, reporters, waiting for his words. For a long, tense moment, he couldn't breathe. The hush in the air made him feel like any sudden movement would shatter the fragile stillness. He stood with his hands clenched at his sides, summoning every ounce of courage he had. No one had ever looked to him for answers before, at least not like this. But something inside him had snapped days ago, something that refused to remain silent any longer. He glanced at his mother, Marina, who sat just a few feet away. Her face was as pale as the fluorescent lighting overhead, her eyes darting anxiously between him and the judge. That worried look told him she might already know what he was about to say. The thought twisted his stomach in knots. He had no desire to hurt her, but he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. Matthew took a shaky breath, then spoke. "They knew," he said, his voice echoing in the hush. "My father, he's been hiding what really happened. And everyone in the family, just pretended it wasn't real." The magnitude of the statement hung over the courtroom. Gasps fluttered across the gallery. The judge seemed taken aback, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to piece together how such a young boy could carry such a heavy claim. Before anyone else could speak, an outburst of murmuring rolled through the room. People were suddenly alive with speculation, exchanging uneasy glances. But Marina looked like the ground had fallen from beneath her. She stared at her son, her lips parted as though she wanted to protest, to defend her husband, but no words came out. Matthew felt a mixture of guilt and determination. His heart pounded, but a tiny voice inside whispered that this was the only way. He had uncovered something no one wanted him to see, and now it was too big to keep to himself. The judge cleared his throat. "Matthew," he said in a low, careful tone, "can you tell this court what exactly you believe your father knew? And what has been hidden from you?" For a second, Matthew's mind went blank. He swallowed hard. Months of anxiety, of clandestine eavesdropping on half-heard arguments, and piecing together stolen scraps of conversation, they all came flooding back. It was overwhelming, like trying to hold back a tidal wave. He forced himself to be steady. "I overheard my parents talking weeks ago," Matthew said, his voice rasping from strain. "They were arguing about something that happened years ago. Father got into serious trouble with the law. That's what they said. But not just some minor scheme, something bigger. Mom said we had to tell the authorities, or it would destroy our family from the inside." He paused, wetting his lips with his tongue, aware that every eye was locked on him. He had to push onward. But Father convinced her to stay quiet. He told her no one would believe them. And so they hid it. They hid everything. He broke off, uncertain how much to reveal, uncertain if the words might tear his family apart forever. But that was the price, wasn't it? The truth always came at a cost. Marina's face was stricken. A tear slipped down her cheek. Matthew felt a stabbing guilt at the sight, but it was too late to stop. The judge asked him to clarify further, but just then something happened that no one expected. The side door creaked open, and in rushed a figure who looked equally terrified and outraged, Uncle Daniel. He was Mother's brother, a man who had always been soft-spoken, a calm presence during holiday gatherings, the person who would pull a silly face to make Matthew laugh when things got tense. But now Daniel looked anything but calm. He hurried forward, guided by an officer, as though he'd come with a message too urgent to wait. The crowd's whispers swelled again. Matthew felt the swirl of tension ratchet up another notch. Before the judge could protest, Daniel's voice rang out, desperate and raw. "Wait, stop everything!" The bailiffs reached to restrain him, but the judge motioned for calm. Everyone in the room stared, not quite sure what Daniel could possibly add to the drama unfolding. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" the judge demanded, but with caution in his eyes. Even a judge of many years could sense how precarious the moment was. Daniel's gaze locked on Matthew, then flicked to Marina. "I was afraid this would happen," he said, voice trembling. "I was afraid Jonathan's secrets would come to light this way." Jonathan, Matthew's father, wasn't present in the courtroom that day. Ironically, he was due to appear later regarding unrelated legal proceedings. Or at least that was what Matthew had been told. The confusion of it all never made sense to him. Why was his father never around to face these accusations head-on? The judge tried to restore order, but tension crackled through the air. Matthew felt dizzy. He desperately wanted to know what Daniel knew. And if Daniel was here, it meant only one thing. The truth was bigger than a quiet argument behind closed doors. It involved uncles, aunts, maybe people beyond their family. Matthew took a sharp breath, forcing himself to find some calm in the chaos. He realized the time for half measures had passed. "It's not just old fraud charges," Matthew said, stepping away from the witness stand so he could face Daniel directly. "Is it?" That single question, that simple challenge, hung in the air like an echo that wouldn't fade. Daniel swallowed, his eyes red, rimmed with emotion. "No, Matthew. It isn't. There's so much more." A hush fell once again. It seemed no one in the room even dared to shift in their seats. "Jonathan, your father, has been working with dangerous people. I don't know how it started, but he dragged your mother into it too. He told her it was the only way to keep your family afloat after he—" Daniel paused, pressing his lips together. "After he made mistakes he couldn't take back. And it just kept spiraling from there." Marina buried her face in her hands. Matthew's mind reeled. He thought he had braced himself for anything, but hearing Daniel confirm his worst fears about father's involvement in something far darker than mere financial crimes struck him like a physical blow. He wanted to shut it out, to pretend none of it was real. But how could he? Marina stood. Her legs wobbled, and a bailiff had to steady her by the arm. She looked at Daniel, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why are you telling them now? Why not let them find out gradually? We could have." She trailed off, ashamed perhaps, or simply too overwhelmed to speak. "Because your son," Daniel replied, his voice firming, "shouldn't be the one forced to carry these burdens alone. He's just a boy, Marina." "I'm not just a boy," Matthew said quietly, surprising even himself with the steadiness of his tone. "Not anymore." The judge rubbed his temples, clearly struggling to maintain the formalities of a court session when so much raw emotion was exploding before him. "I need order in this courtroom," he barked, but his voice held more caution than anger. He gestured for Daniel to calm down and signaled for Matthew to return to the stand. "If all this is true," he said, "then we have a far more complicated situation than I realized. We will need testimonies, documents, evidence. But for the moment, we must proceed with caution." "Where's Jonathan now?" Daniel shot a worried look at the judge, then at Marina. "He was supposed to be brought here for his hearing. But last I heard, officers said he hadn't turned himself in. They think he's on the run." Gasps erupted around the courtroom. Marina went pale. Matthew tried to make sense of it. Why would father run? Then it hit him. If father really was tangled in something as dangerous as everyone said, maybe he would run to protect himself. Or maybe he was trying to protect them. But was that remotely believable after what had already happened? At that moment, an officer stationed at the back of the courtroom stepped forward, leaning in to whisper something to the judge. The judge's face became grim, and he nodded before turning back to the rest of the room. "It appears," he announced, "that new information has surfaced. There are additional investigations ongoing. Bailiff, see that Ms. Marina and her son have protection. We're going to recess until we can locate Jonathan." Matthew's entire body shuddered with tension. Protection? From whom? From father? That idea was too ghastly to accept. But the look on the officer's face told him everything he needed to know. This was out of control, bigger than any single hearing. The security detail moved to escort Matthew and Marina out of the courtroom, but Daniel quickly intervened. "I'll come too," he insisted. "They're family. I can help." Marina didn't resist. Maybe she needed Daniel's presence, a voice of reason in the swirling madness of revelations and legal drama. Maybe she was too exhausted to refuse. As they left the imposing double doors behind, the cameras outside flashed like strobe lights. Matthew squinted against them, his chest tight with anxiety. He felt like a caged animal displayed for the world to see. That was never who he wanted to be. He heard reporters calling out his name, shouting questions he was too numb to answer. "Matthew, do you think your father is dangerous? Did your mother know all along? Is your father fleeing the country?" He squeezed Marina's hand, and she squeezed back. In that moment, he could almost feel the fear coursing through her. No matter what she'd done or hidden, she was still his mother, and he loved her in a way he couldn't separate from the swirling sense of betrayal. The security detail hurried them away from the shouting frenzy, steering them toward a side exit. Daniel followed closely, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting an ambush. Once outside, they were rushed into a waiting vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows. The drive that followed felt surreal, quiet except for the hum of the engine and Daniel's occasional sigh. Marina stared out the window, her expression vacant. Matthew wondered what was running through her mind. Was she imagining life without Jonathan? Was she thinking of all the secrets that had piled up over the years? Maybe, he thought bitterly, she was just relieved it was all coming into the open. Still, guilt stabbed at him. He was the one who had forced the truth into the light. Yet some stubborn part of him refused to regret it. "Mom," he said softly, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry if this hurts you. But I couldn't keep quiet." She turned, and her eyes glistened with tears. "I know," she managed. "I know, Matt. I'm not angry at you. I never wanted this." There was so much she wasn't saying. He could almost see the weight pressing down on her shoulders. He tried to muster a comforting smile, but it felt hollow. Daniel cleared his throat. "We need to figure out our next step. The police are looking for Jonathan, and they'll find him eventually. But we need to make sure you two are safe until then." His voice was gentle, but the seriousness of it made Matthew's pulse quicken again. "Safe from what?" Matthew asked. "My father might be mixed up in something terrible, but would he really? I mean, do you think he'd ever hurt us?" The thought was horrifying, impossible to fathom. Daniel pressed his lips into a thin line. Jonathan's not acting rationally. If the rumors are true, if he really is involved in organized crime, then there could be others, dangerous people, who'll do anything to protect themselves. Even if Jonathan wouldn't hurt you, they might. They'll see you and your mother as threats. When big money and big secrets are at stake, compassion rarely comes into play. Marina let out a soft gasp, covering her mouth with one hand. Matthew felt the knot of fear twist in his gut. It was suddenly all too real. "So what do we do?" he whispered. Daniel looked at him. "I'm taking you both to a safe place until the police can figure this out." "Matt, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Matthew had no response for that. Apologies felt woefully inadequate compared to what was unraveling in front of them. His father, a criminal? His mother, complicit in hiding the truth? And now the threat of real danger? He stared down at his trembling hands, trying and failing to find a sense of calm. He missed the simplicity of just a few months ago, when his biggest worry was finishing homework or whether his father would let him stay up to watch a late-night basketball game. When the SUV finally stopped, they pulled up to a modest house at the end of a quiet street. It didn't look like the safe house Matthew had pictured from movies, some fortified bunker behind steel gates. Instead, it was just an ordinary single-story home with drawn curtains and a neatly trimmed lawn, blending into a normal neighborhood. But if that was the point, it made sense. To hide in plain sight. 2 more officers waited outside, exchanging curt nods with Daniel as they stepped out. One of them offered a polite greeting to Marina and Matthew, then ushered them inside. The interior was Spartan, with minimal furniture and walls painted in neutral tones. It smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. Matthew felt a shiver. It was a place designed for functionality, not comfort. They settled in a small living area, where a couch and a pair of worn-looking chairs faced a TV set. Marina sank onto the couch, her posture collapsed, as though the stress were physically crushing her. Matthew carefully sat next to her, at a loss for words. He could sense Daniel's agitation. His uncle paced the floor, pulling out his phone and making quiet calls. Matthew caught fragments of conversation, references to updated addresses, or checking in with certain people, but Daniel never spoke loud enough for him to gather a complete picture. Time dragged by in an anxious haze. Matthew's mind wouldn't stop cycling through the events of the day. The courtroom. His confession. Mother's tears. Father's unknown whereabouts. He wished he could rewind everything or at least slow it down, but time marched onward whether he liked it or not. Finally, Daniel ended a call and rubbed his temples. "They're setting up another hearing as soon as they locate Jonathan," he said, addressing Marina gently. "We need statements from both of you, sworn affidavits, everything. But for now, the biggest concern is that you're safe." Marina nodded absently, as though not fully processing his words. Matthew, on the other hand, felt something flare inside him, anger, perhaps. He wanted to see Father, to demand an explanation. He had to know how Jonathan could throw them into this turmoil. But he also feared the answers. What if Father really was the monster these allegations made him out to be? The day passed in an uneasy lull. Officers came and went, checking on them, bringing takeout food none of them really had the appetite to eat. Marina dozed fitfully on the couch, and Daniel locked himself in the other room to make calls. Left alone with his thoughts, Matthew found himself sifting through memories of Father. Had there been signs? Suspicious phone calls, unexpected absences, cryptic remarks? He remembered the time Father claimed to be on a business trip, but returned early looking disheveled and agitated. Or the time Father had insisted they not ask too many questions about his new venture. Looking back, it was obvious something was wrong, but no one wanted to see it. Night fell. The house's silence was broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Daniel emerged from the back room, looking more tired than ever. "Matt," he said softly, beckoning him over. "I've been talking with an officer named Detective Caldwell. She's heading the investigation into your father. There's more to this than just a few forged documents or hidden bank accounts." Matthew swallowed, bracing himself. "What do you mean?" "It's a network," Daniel explained, brow furrowing. "An underground syndicate that's been siphoning money through legitimate businesses. Your father's name keeps popping up, especially in connection with an associate, someone known as Aunt Juliet. Does that name ring a bell?" Matthew shook his head slowly. "Oh, I've never heard of her." Daniel exhaled, then sank down into one of the chairs. "I'm worried, Matt. I'm worried there's a lot more. Caldwell believes your father's been helping to launder money for these people, and that he's deeper in than even he realizes. It's dangerous for him, and for all of you too." Marina stirred at the sound of voices and sat up. Her eyes were bloodshot from crying. "Juliet? Jonathan never mentioned a Juliet," she murmured. "But he kept a lot of secrets. Anything's possible." "Detective Caldwell is planning to come by in the morning," Daniel said. "She wants to speak with both of you. Get your statements, see if there's anything you can recall that might help locate Jonathan. But for now, we should try to rest." He spoke the word rest like it was something simple and easily obtained, but Matthew doubted any of them would sleep. The weight of fear pressed down on him every time he closed his eyes. All he could think about was his father's face, the father who taught him to ride a bike, the father who'd once sat beside him at the kitchen table while he agonized over algebra homework. Was that man gone forever? Or had that man never truly existed at all? Eventually, exhaustion beat out the swirling anxiety, and Matthew dozed off on the couch. His dreams were fraught, flashes of the courtroom, the judge's gavel echoing like a thunderclap, then images of Father standing in shadows, unrecognizable except for his voice. When Matthew jerked awake, heart pounding, early morning sunlight was seeping through a gap in the curtains. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then reality crashed down, heavier than ever. He saw Daniel rummaging in the small kitchenette. Uncle must have sensed Matthew stirring, because he turned with a forced smile. "Morning," he said quietly as if not wanting to wake Marina. Coffee? Matthew nodded gratefully. Though he never drank coffee much at home, the warmth and slight bitterness felt like a small comfort. He sipped slowly, trying to steady himself. Any news? He asked in a hushed tone. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. The police tried a few addresses tied to Jonathan, but he wasn't there. They're expanding the search. Detective Caldwell's on her way. Matthew managed a tight nod. He tried to focus on the present, to stay calm. Then his mother stirred. She sat up, rubbed her eyes, and gave them both a weary glance. Did either of you sleep? She asked. Daniel shook his head again, and Matthew just shrugged. Sleep had been more like a series of restless jolts in and out of grim dreams. Still, there was no time to dwell on that. A sharp knock at the door jolted them all. Daniel stepped over, carefully verifying who was outside. A muffled voice identified itself as law enforcement, and moments later a woman in a crisp, dark blazer stepped through the doorway, a leather folder in her hand. Behind her stood another officer, watchful. Detective Caldwell, she introduced herself, scanning the room quickly. She had a calm air about her, but her eyes were intense, as though taking in everything at once. I'm glad you're all here. I'd prefer we speak somewhere private, but I understand this safe house isn't exactly spacious. Is Ms. Marina available to talk? Marina stood, smoothing her rumpled clothes, trying to gather some semblance of composure. Yes, I'm here. Her voice wavered, but the attempt at steadiness was there. Caldwell nodded. We can speak first, then I'd like to talk to Matthew alone, if that's all right. I know he's a minor, so Daniel or you can be present if that's more comfortable. But we do need his statement. Matthew clenched his jaw, readying himself. He wouldn't back away now. But first, the detective sat with Marina at the far side of the room, Daniel hovering protectively. Matthew tried not to eavesdrop, but it was impossible not to catch fragments. Any unusual visitors or phone calls Jonathan made in the last year? I just knew something was off, but he said it was necessary. I should have spoken up sooner. Connected to a figure known as Juliet, but we haven't confirmed her real identity. She's rumored to be extremely well connected in these circles. Matthew's pulse thudded. Juliet? Whoever she was, the name already sent chills through him. It sounded like the kind of code name a shadowy figure in a spy thriller would have. But this wasn't fiction. These events were happening all around him, tangling his family in a web he never could have imagined. After a while, the detective turned to Matthew. I'd like to speak with you now, Caldwell said kindly. She gestured to one of the chairs. We can sit here if you're comfortable. Matthew felt the sting of nerves. Sure, he muttered, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. You have the right to have your mother or your uncle here, if you want, she reminded him. He glanced at Marina, then at Daniel. Both looked uneasy, but supportive. It's okay, Matthew said. They can stay. I've got nothing to hide. Caldwell nodded, clicking her pen. The other officer took a position near the door. She started simply, but with a seriousness in her tone. Matthew, I understand this has been overwhelming. But we need you to be honest and thorough. Could you walk me through what you heard when you first suspected your father was involved in illegal activity? Matthew took a shaky breath, then began. He described the hushed arguments late at night, the fragments of conversation about large sums of money, father's suspicious mood swings, the business trips that didn't add up. He felt himself trembling with each confession. It was different from testifying in court. Here, Caldwell's eyes never left him, and there was no crowd of onlookers. Still, the weight of these revelations pressed on him just as heavily. When he finished, Caldwell studied him. I know that was difficult. Thank you. One more question. Did your father ever mention a name like Juliet? Or any indication he was taking orders from someone else? Matthew hesitated. No, he admitted. He never mentioned that. If anything, he acted like he was on his own. But my uncle said he's heard about Juliet from the police. I don't know who she is, but if she's the one controlling him, that might explain a lot. Caldwell nodded, scribbling notes. We have reason to believe Juliet is a major player, a coordinator of these laundering operations. Your father isn't the only person who's been roped in. People get stuck in this, Matthew, and they find it hard to leave. Her eyes flicked to Marina. Do you think he might have felt trapped? Marina answered in a faint voice. He said as much once. Late at night he told me he'd gone too far. That he'd made promises and accepted money from powerful people. She closed her eyes. I tried to get him to stop, but he said they'd come after us if he did. Caldwell reached out gently. Ms. Marina, I know this is painful, but any detail could help us. The sooner we find Jonathan, the sooner we can make sure you're safe. We want him to come in peacefully, but we can't risk letting this operation continue. Marina covered her face with her hands for a moment, regaining composure. Then she nodded. I understand. Just then, Daniel's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowned, and stepped aside to answer. Caldwell waited, but she seemed on edge. Matthew could see the tension in the set of her jaw. Everyone in that small space knew they were playing a dangerous game. If Father had truly fled, if he believed turning himself in was more dangerous than staying out there, it could escalate quickly. Daniel returned, swallowing hard. I just got an update, he said, voice subdued. There are sightings of Jonathan near the old warehouses by the harbor. The police are heading there now. He glanced at Caldwell. They want your assistance on site. Caldwell rose immediately, snapping her folder shut. That's where I'll go then. This might be our chance to resolve this. I'll leave an officer here, in case you need anything. She paused, looking at Matthew. Stay inside, all of you. Until we know more, it's still not safe. Marina nodded. Be careful, she whispered, worry evident. Caldwell offered a tight smile, then disappeared through the front door with the other officer. The sound of a car engine soon faded down the street. Matthew felt a jolt of conflicting emotions, relief that the search for Father might be nearing an end, and dread of what would happen when they found him. Would Father resist? Would someone get hurt? The memories of that tense courtroom scene returned with a vengeance, stirring up guilt and fear. He hadn't expected his confession to bring them to this. Daniel paced in the living room, phone clutched in his hand. Maybe this can end peacefully, he murmured. We can only hope. Marina looked up at him. What if it doesn't? Jonathan isn't thinking clearly. He might do something desperate. Daniel's jaw clenched. I know, but we have to trust the authorities. We can't run around the city ourselves, not with Matthew here. And especially if those criminals are still out there, watching. He shot a worried glance at the curtained window, as though a pair of eyes might be lurking beyond it. Matthew closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant that clung to the house. He didn't want to just sit and wait. But what else could he do? He was 15, frightened, and uncertain. The only thing he knew for sure was that telling the truth in that courtroom had set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Was it worth it? A small voice inside insisted that yes, it was. Lies had a way of poisoning everything from the inside out. Hours crawled by. They huddled together in restless silence, none of them able to tear their thoughts away from the confrontation unfolding somewhere across the city. Daniel's phone rang periodically with updates from Caldwell, but they were vague, telling them only that officers were in pursuit or that they believed Jonathan had fled to yet another location. It was like a cat-and-mouse chase with no end in sight. Then, well past sunset, a call finally came that made Daniel go pale. He pressed the phone close to his ear, eyes darting anxiously, while Marina and Matthew watched. What do you mean? Daniel's voice cracked. Where? Are you sure it's him? The pause. His knuckles whitened around the phone. All right, we'll be ready. When he ended the call, he turned to them, clearly shaken. They caught sight of him again, Daniel said softly. Caldwell said he's cornered at an abandoned shipyard. They're going to move in soon. Marina's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Jonathan, her voice trembled. He must be so terrified. Matthew wanted to scream that Father had done this to himself, that he should face the consequences. But the raw grief in his mother's eyes squashed that impulse. No matter how angry he felt, this was still his dad. And hearing that he was cornered by the police made his heart pound in a tumult of emotions. Anger, pity, fear, all at once. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, after a brief exchange, he held it out toward Marina with a look of disbelief. He wants to talk to you, Daniel whispered. He's asking for you by name. Marina stared at the phone like it was a venomous snake. Should I? Matthew wasn't sure what to say. He wanted answers. Part of him yearned to snatch that phone and demand to know why father had done all this. Another part of him dreaded hearing whatever excuse or explanation father might offer. But in the end, Marina's trembling hands reached out. She pressed the phone to her ear, voice quivering. Jonathan? A silence stretched, broken only by the shallow rise and fall of her breath. Matthew and Daniel inched closer, trying to catch any hint of father's voice. Marina's face shifted from fear to heartbreak. "But I can't do that," she whispered at one point, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Please, Jonathan, just surrender. Don't make this worse." A few seconds later, she went pale, eyes widening. "Juliet? Who is Juliet?" Her gaze flicked to Daniel, who looked confused. "Jonathan, talk to me. What do you mean she's here?" "Jonathan?" Suddenly, the line went dead. Marina kept the phone pressed to her ear, as if hoping to resurrect father's voice by sheer will. But it was over. She lowered the phone, breathing shakily. "He said he can't let them take him alive. He said Juliet was there, and that if he got arrested She trailed off, her eyes filling with fresh tears. Matthew felt the blood drain from his face. Juliet, the name from the detective's file, the rumored mastermind. Was she with father now? The pieces clicked in his mind. Maybe Juliet was that final link, the person father had truly been afraid of. And if she was on the scene, then who knew what might happen next? He had no time to ask more questions. Daniel was already punching in Caldwell's number, frantically telling her that father had just called, that Juliet was supposedly with him. Marina sank back onto the couch, tears in her eyes. Matthew sat beside her, letting her lean against him. No matter how complicated things were between them, he couldn't shut out her pain. Several agonizing minutes later, Daniel set down the phone. "Caldwell's mobilizing more units," he said. "She wants us to stay right here. Absolutely do not come to the shipyard." Marina nodded mutely. Matthew looked at both of them, searching for any sign of hope. But their expressions were bleak. If father was truly cornered and Juliet was there, this was likely to end in violence. The question was whether father would make it out alive. All they could do was wait, hearts pounding in their chests. The safe house felt more claustrophobic than ever, the walls too close, the ceiling too low. The realization that none of them could control the outcome sank in with crushing finality. All they could do was wonder if this was the night their family was irreversibly broken. Night stretched on, a thick blanket of uncertainty that weighed heavily on every breath Matthew took. He imagined an industrial shipyard, the echo of footsteps on wet concrete, the glare of floodlights illuminating rusted cargo containers, and the silhouettes of armed officers edging closer to his father. Jonathan was out there, cornered, desperate, and somewhere in the shadows lurked Juliet, a person whose name had come to symbolize the heart of this conspiracy. The idea that she was with Jonathan made Matthew's blood run cold. He pictured a figure with a cunning smile, ready to do anything to protect her operation. The phone call had been brief, but one statement lingered, father saying he couldn't let them take him alive. He stayed close to his mother, Marina, as the minutes passed like hours. Daniel paced, phone in hand, jumping at every text or ping. The officer stationed outside kept checking in, assuring them that Detective Caldwell was in communication, but offering no real details. Occasionally, Marina would tear up, then try to collect herself, forcing a grim composure for Matthew's sake. She seemed torn between guilt, anger, and genuine fear. Finally, close to midnight, Daniel's phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen, inhaled, then answered. "Yes? Are you sure? My God. All right, I'll tell them." His voice was hushed, tense. When he ended the call, he turned to face them, a mixture of relief and dread shaping his features. "They've arrested Juliet. She tried to slip away during the standoff, but Caldwell's team tracked her down. She's in custody now, and several of her associates were rounded up, too. It sounds like a massive operation unraveling." Marina's eyes brightened momentarily. That's good, right?" She almost couldn't believe it. With Juliet caught, maybe the source of their nightmares would be contained. Daniel glanced at Matthew. It's good, yes, but Jonathan's still missing. He escaped the perimeter. They're searching the shipyard, the docks, every building within a mile. But no one can find him. He slipped away in the chaos. Matthew swallowed hard. So he's out there, alone. Marina leaned forward, clinging to Daniel's words. You said Juliet's been arrested. Then Jonathan, he could come home, right? He doesn't have to keep running. The real criminals are behind bars, so why would he? Daniel shook his head. I don't think it's that simple. There may still be other players we haven't heard of. And Jonathan's facing serious charges himself. He knows that if he comes back, he'll be taken in. He's probably terrified. Marina fell silent, absorbing the implications. Matthew felt a knot twist inside him. He wanted to believe that father would return, that he'd walk in the front door, throw his arms around them, and swear he'd make everything right. But was that just a child's fantasy? The memory of father's frantic words on the phone, I can't let them take me, suggested otherwise. That night, none of them slept. Dawn arrived in a muted swirl of gray clouds, and the air was heavy with dread. Another day in the safe house began, and even the routine tasks felt strange. Daniel reheated leftover coffee, which no one really wanted. Marina picked listlessly at a piece of toast. Matthew stared at the TV in the corner, which they kept muted to avoid hearing too many sensationalized reports about the biggest criminal case of the year. None of them could bear to watch. Shortly after sunrise, Detective Caldwell returned, looking more exhausted than before. She brought along an officer who carried a large black binder. Caldwell's face was set in a grim mask, though her eyes had a flicker of urgency. I have updates, she said, once they were all gathered in the living room again. We have Juliet in custody, along with a handful of her associates. It's been a long night of interrogation, but they're not being cooperative yet. Marina leaned forward, anxiety etched on her face. Did you learn anything about Jonathan? Where he might have gone? Caldwell's lips thinned. We believe he's on foot. Possibly he's trying to reach a safe location he thinks hasn't been compromised. Juliet's operation was extensive. We discovered records of safe houses, stash points, multiple bank accounts. It's possible Jonathan knows how to access them, or he may be trying to lie low somewhere we haven't identified yet. She cast a sympathetic glance at Matthew. I need to ask again. Can either of you think of any special property, a friend's place, an empty building Jonathan used to talk about? Marina and Daniel exchanged looks, each searching their memories. Finally, Daniel ventured, Jonathan owned a small cabin up in the hills years ago. But he sold it, or at least he said he did. Marina spoke quietly, her brow furrowing. He used to fish at the river near that property. Did he ever mention buying it back? Her mind seemed to be racing through half-remembered conversations. Caldwell nodded thoughtfully, making a note in her binder. Even if it's not officially in his name anymore, he might be squatting there. We'll have a unit check it out. Matthew couldn't help the swell of conflicting emotions at the thought of father hiding in a rundown cabin, paranoid, alone. He pictured Jonathan crouched by a dusty window, peeking out for signs of approaching officers, every creak of the wood floor making him jump. The image turned Matthew's stomach. Detective, he asked carefully, what happens if you do find him? He's not dangerous, is he? Caldwell's eyes softened, but her voice remained professional. He's your father, Matthew, so I know this is personal for you. But from a law enforcement perspective, he's armed, frightened, and he has a lot of charges hanging over him. We have to proceed with caution. She paused, letting the gravity of that settle over them. Our goal is to bring him in safely, but that depends on his actions too. Marina exhaled shakily, tears threatening to resurface. He won't hurt anyone intentionally. He's scared out of his mind. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll do everything we can to help him surrender peacefully. Caldwell spent the next hour with them, going over every possible hideout Jonathan might attempt. An old office building he'd once managed, a friend's vacant commercial property, the remnants of his previous failed business ventures. Each possibility was added to a growing list. The officer who accompanied her made calls, dispatching different units to check each site. It felt strange to watch so many strangers coordinate a manhunt for your husband, your father, your brother-in-law. The house was silent except for the quiet, urgent phone calls, the scribble of pens, the soft hum of the air conditioning. Eventually, Caldwell departed, leaving behind a renewed sense of tension. Marina wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the morning. Matthew tried to focus on the silver lining that Juliet, the woman at the core of it all, had been apprehended. Without her leadership, maybe the rest of the criminal network would dissolve. But that still didn't erase his father's culpability. Hours passed in a blur of monotony. They watched the news, heard speculation about the mysterious head of a laundering syndicate now in custody, her rumored global connections, the FBI stepping in. Matthew ignored most of it. He'd had enough sensational headlines. He just wanted his family back. Around mid-afternoon, Daniel suddenly stiffened. He'd been checking a local news channel on his phone and cursed under his breath. There's some leak. The reporters say they've identified Jonathan as a prime suspect in the ring. They're broadcasting his photo all over the city. Marina's face went pale. Oh God. Then everyone knows. His coworkers, our neighbors? Matthew's throat tightened. Their family name was now synonymous with crime in the public eye. Rumors and condemnation would spread like wildfire. And what if Jonathan saw the broadcast, realized he had nowhere to run? The pressure might push him to do something desperate. Daniel lowered the phone, his expression conflicted. Maybe public exposure can be a good thing. Someone might spot him, call the police. But it also means Jonathan knows he's out of options. We just have to hope he calls us again or tries to negotiate a surrender. The evening brought no solace. Dinner was a lukewarm attempt at normalcy. They picked at takeout cartons without tasting much of anything. Every so often, Matthew's gaze drifted to his mother, who was silently battling her own guilt. He remembered her words. She had known something was wrong, but Jonathan convinced her to keep silent. If only she'd spoken up earlier, would the fallout have been less devastating? Daniel moved about the house, double-checking doors and windows, as though expecting a threat to leap out from the shadows. All the while, the designated police officer stationed outside occasionally tapped on the door to confirm everything was quiet. It reminded Matthew of being barricaded against a storm they couldn't see. Later that night, after so many hours of torment, Matthew dozed on the couch. He was startled awake by the trill of a phone. Marina jerked upright from her restless sleep, and Daniel came rushing from the kitchen. The ring wasn't from Daniel's phone this time, but rather the house's landline, a cheap phone plugged into the wall near the front door. Daniel snatched it up, ignoring the officer's cautious glance through the window. A tense silence followed as Daniel listened. Then he said, "It's for you, Marina." She rose unsteadily, took the receiver. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her back. "Jonathan," she whispered. Her face contorted with relief. "Where are you? Are you all right?" She listened, her mouth quivering. Matthew inched closer, desperate to hear, but Marina's eyes filled with tears once more. "I can't come there. You need to turn yourself in. Please do it for Matt. This is tearing him apart." She broke into sobs, nearly dropping the phone. Daniel caught it, pressing it back into her hands. She pressed the receiver to her ear again, trying to steady herself. "I don't care about the money or the secrets. I just want you safe. Jonathan, please." Another pause. A heartbreaking whisper, "I love you, but I can't lie for you anymore. Please, surrender." Matthew stood there, silent tears streaking his face. He was torn between anger and longing, anger that father was still running, longing to have him back. Then Marina's expression changed, a spark of something in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Okay, we'll meet you. I promise. Just no violence, Jonathan." Immediately, Daniel gestured in alarm, mouthing the word no. But Marina kept nodding into the phone. "We'll be there. I swear." She hung up, turning to Daniel, who looked ready to explode. "He wants me and Matthew to meet him," she said in a rush, tears still glistening. "He says he's hiding near that old factory off the highway, the one they shut down years ago. He promised he wouldn't hurt us. He said he just wants to see Matthew. He wants to explain." Daniel shook his head adamantly. "Oh, that's insane, Marina. The police are searching everywhere for him. If we walk in there, We could get caught in the crossfire. Or Jonathan might panic. She wiped at her tears. He said if we don't come, he'll disappear forever. He's already thinking about fleeing the state. I can't let that happen. We need to end this, Daniel. Then she turned to Matthew, eyes pleading. You should stay here, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. You've already been through so much. But he asked to see you specifically and… Matthew spoke, voice trembling but resolute. I have to talk to him. I have to look him in the eye and tell him everything. That he needs to give himself up, that we love him, but this can't go on. Daniel let out a choked sigh. We have to call Caldwell. She'll set up a safe plan. We can't just walk into an abandoned factory by ourselves. Marina hesitated, staring at the phone. Jonathan said if we bring the police, he'll know. He'll run. He said this is between family now. She closed her eyes. I know we should call Caldwell, but that might scare him off. Daniel exhaled, looking torn. All right, but I'm coming with you. I'm not letting you walk in there alone. She gave a shaky nod. Fine. But what if the police track us? If they realize we've left the safe house? Matthew felt a swirl of panic. They were pinned between loyalty to Jonathan and the risk of letting him slip away forever. Detective Caldwell wanted him found. But father was threatening to vanish if they followed standard procedures. Every choice felt wrong. Yet Matthew couldn't shake the certainty that if he didn't see his father soon, he might never see him again. Within minutes, they formed a desperate plan. They'd slip away quietly after the officer outside rotated shifts. Daniel would drive them to the old factory, where father was waiting. They'd talk him into surrendering, then call Detective Caldwell to complete the arrest without bloodshed. It was a gamble, one that made Matthew's stomach churn with fear, but they couldn't see another way. The moment the officer on duty stepped away for a brief check-in call, Daniel ushered them to the back door. They slipped out, hearts pounding, climbing into Daniel's sedan under the dim glow of a single street lamp. The sense of betrayal weighed on Matthew. They were deceiving the very people assigned to protect them. But a stronger emotion, family love, or maybe just desperation, pushed him forward. Daniel drove carefully, headlights off until they were a few blocks away, then turned them on to avoid suspicion. The city lights gave way to a quieter stretch of highway, then a narrower side road where overgrown weeds pressed at the asphalt. In the passenger seat, Marina clenched her hands. Matthew sat in the back, trying not to tremble at every bump in the road. The fear of an ambush haunted him. Maybe father wasn't alone. Maybe this was a trap. But then he banished the thought. Whatever else Jonathan had done, he wouldn't intentionally harm them, right? After half an hour of tense silence, they reached the chain-link fence marking the perimeter of the defunct factory. Metal towers and skeletal structures loomed in the moonlight. Daniel guided the car through a gap in the fence, parking behind a cluster of dead shrubs. They stepped out cautiously into the chill night air, the distant hum of wind against rusting metal creating an eerie backdrop. Marina led the way, hugging her arms around herself as if for warmth. Daniel stayed just behind her, scanning the darkness. Matthew followed, feeling his heart pound with every step. The main entrance was boarded up, but there was a side door missing half its panels. Daniel slipped inside first, motioning for them to follow. The interior smelled of dust and decay, broken glass crunching underfoot. A single flashlight guided them through corridors lined with rusty machinery and collapsed piping. The noise of dripping water echoed in the silence. They reached a wide, open space, perhaps once a loading area for large trucks. Moonlight filtered through shattered skylights, painting the concrete floor in patches of silver and shadow. And then they saw him. Jonathan stood near the far wall, still wearing the same tattered jacket from who knew how many days before. His hair was unkempt, face drawn, and in his grip was a small handgun, held down by his side, but clearly visible. Marina gasped, raising both hands in a plea. Jonathan, oh my God. Put that down, please. He glanced at the weapon as if surprised he was even holding it. Slowly, he raised his free hand, a gesture of uncertain peace. I'm sorry, he said, voice hoarse. I can't let them arrest me, Marina. Not after everything. Matthew swallowed, stepping forward, ignoring Daniel's attempt to hold him back. "Dad," he said, heart pounding. "Please. This has to stop." Jonathan turned, eyes flicking to his son. For a brief moment, his hardened expression cracked, showing raw regret. "Matt, you shouldn't have come here." He exhaled, a ragged sound. "But maybe it's right that you see me this way. Because this is who I am now." Matthew's throat felt tight. "You're my father," he whispered. "And maybe I never knew about all the lies, but I still care." He struggled with the rush of emotion. "I just want this to end." Jonathan took a step closer, the gun swinging slightly at his side. Marina flinched, but he didn't raise it. "I was in too deep," he confessed, voice low. "You have no idea the hold they had on me. Juliet, she found me at my weakest, promised me a way out of my financial mess. But once I accepted her help, there was no going back. She forced me to commit crimes, to funnel money, to bring your mother's reputation into it. And when I tried to stop, she threatened to ruin us all. I knew it was only a matter of time before it blew up." Marina's voice shook. "Then why didn't you come to me? Why didn't we face it together before it was too late?" He let out a bitter laugh. "I was ashamed. I didn't want to drag you down with me." His gaze went to Matthew, pained. "I never wanted you to know. I thought I could fix it quietly, pay off debts, cut ties. But Juliet's operation was bigger than anything I'd imagined." Daniel edged in, voice firm but calm. "Juliet is in custody, Jonathan. Her network is falling apart. You can still do the right thing." Jonathan's eyes widened. "They caught her?" He looked around, fear twisting his features. "Then her other associates will come after me, or they'll let me take all the blame. Don't you see? I'm better off running." Marina stepped forward, trembling. "Jonathan, you can't run forever. And if you do, you'll never see us again. Is that what you want? To watch your son grow up from the shadows?" He looked at the floor. "No," he whispered. Then, with a shaky breath, he turned his gaze on Matthew. "I'm sorry, son. Truly. When I heard what you said in that courtroom, I hated it at first. I was furious. But a part of me knew you were right. I've been lying too long, dragging everyone down." Matthew felt tears burning at the corners of his eyes. "So come with us. We'll figure it out. The police might lock you up, but maybe if you cooperate, if you testify, there's a chance. At least we'll know you're safe, that we can still visit you, talk to you." Jonathan's hand tightened around the gun. For a heart-stopping moment, Matthew feared he might do something terrible. But then, father sank to his knees, letting the weapon drop with a clatter onto the concrete floor. The sound reverberated through the empty factory. Jonathan buried his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I can't keep running." Relief flooded Matthew, so intense his legs almost gave out. Marina rushed forward, carefully kicking the gun away before kneeling beside Jonathan. She wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down both their faces. Daniel pressed a hand to his mouth, eyes closed as if in silent thanks. For a moment, it was as though time stopped, letting them breathe in the relief that no one had been hurt, that perhaps the worst was finally behind them. But they all knew it wasn't over. The next steps would be painful. Jonathan would face the law, answer for his crimes, likely spend years away from them. Marina would have to face her own complicity, her knowledge that things were wrong and her silence about them. And Matthew, he'd have to live with the complicated legacy of what his father did, the memory of this forsaken factory echoing in his mind. Daniel retrieved his phone, calling Detective Caldwell with shaking hands. "It's done," he said, voice breaking. "Jonathan's surrendering. We're at the old factory, near the highway. Send your officers, but please, no guns drawn. He's unarmed now." He gave her directions, then hung up. When Jonathan finally looked up, his face was streaked with tears and grime. He turned to his son, voice choking with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Matt." Matthew swallowed. "I know," he said softly. "I'm sorry too." They clung to each other in silence, father and son, mother beside them, until the distant wail of sirens cut through the night. Flashing red and blue lights soon invaded the darkness, throwing shadows across the factory's crumbling walls. Officers entered cautiously, calling out warnings, but Daniel held up both hands, urging calm. He's surrendered, Daniel repeated. It's all right. Detective Caldwell stepped into view, flanked by half a dozen uniformed cops. She nodded, eyes flicking between Jonathan on his knees and the dropped gun on the ground. She spoke calmly. Jonathan, I need you to stand up and put your hands behind your head. He did so without hesitation, tears still shining in his eyes. The moment they cuffed him, Matthew felt an invisible cord snap inside him. His father was in custody. Everything that had led them here, every lie, every piece of hidden evidence, every threat, it had culminated in this. Marina stood aside, trembling, as Jonathan was gently guided away by officers. She clutched Matthew's arm, unsure if she might collapse under the weight of heartbreak. Daniel hovered close, trying to offer some measure of comfort. Caldwell's voice was solemn. We'll handle him with care, but he does have to face charges. I'm sorry. She looked at Matthew, compassion clear in her eyes. I know this is painful, but you did the right thing coming here and helping him surrender safely. Matthew nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt too tight for words. Marina turned away as they led Jonathan toward a patrol car. She gazed at Matthew with red-rimmed eyes. Thank you for being brave, she whispered, voice cracking. You saved his life. If we hadn't come, who knows what might have happened? Matthew's tears finally broke free. They stood there in the flickering lights of police vehicles, each of them trying to piece together the magnitude of what had just transpired. The factory walls seemed to close in, as though reflecting the claustrophobia of their lives these past days. And yet, for all the heartbreak, there was also a strange sense of relief. Jonathan might be gone from their day-to-day life for a while, but at least they knew he was alive, that he hadn't chosen a desperate, irreversible path. Caldwell motioned for them. We'll need official statements again, yours too, Marina, for how you located him. But for now, let's get you somewhere safe. Are you all right going back to the station with me? Marina nodded, wiping her tears. Yes, whatever we need to do. Daniel cast a glance at Matthew, who simply shrugged numbly. His emotions were beyond simple processing. He felt drained, hollowed out, as though the entire day had carved pieces out of him. They followed Caldwell back to the police cars, where Jonathan was already inside one, head bowed. Matthew averted his gaze, not ready to look his father in the eyes behind a police cage. The ride to the station was subdued. Marina stared at her hands. Daniel sat in silence. Matthew watched the city lights blur past the window, a swirl of neon and headlights against the dark. He felt the full weight of all that had been lost in the last few days. Their sense of normalcy, their family unity, and maybe his own childhood innocence. He wished he had the power to rewind, to stop father from ever taking that first step into crime. But if there was a lesson, maybe it was that the truth, however ugly, was still better than a beautiful lie. At least now they had a chance to heal. They arrived at the station, where the bustle of overnight officers and the faint hum of fluorescent lights felt surreal. Caldwell guided them to a quiet interview room, offering them water. Over the next hour, they explained how Jonathan had contacted them, how they drove out alone to meet him, how he surrendered peacefully. Caldwell recorded every detail. Eventually, she gave a weary nod. Thank you. I know this isn't easy, but you've helped us close a critical piece of this investigation. With Jonathan and Juliet both in custody, we can hopefully unravel the rest. Marina rubbed her temples. How long before we can see him? Caldwell's expression was compassionate but straightforward. There will be formalities, booking, medical checks, attorney consultations. He'll be transferred to a holding facility. If he's cooperative, we might set up a visitation soon. But be prepared for the legal process. We'll have a clearer picture in a few days. Marina swallowed, nodding. Matthew felt both relief and dread. A few days? It might as well be years, the way time dragged lately. But at least it wasn't forever. They could see father again, talk to him, try to mend the pieces of this broken puzzle. Around them, the station buzzed with activity, other suspects being processed, phones ringing. One of Caldwell's colleagues poked his head in. Detective, we have Juliet ready for transfer, but she's asking to speak with you. Caldwell sighed. That's not unexpected. She's probably trying to cut a deal. She turned back to Marina and Matthew. We'll need to figure out your next steps. You're technically still under protective custody, but with Jonathan arrested, the immediate threat might be reduced. Are you comfortable returning to your home, or would you rather stay at the safe house a bit longer until we confirm no other associates of Juliet are roaming about? Marina exchanged a glance with Daniel, who rubbed a hand across his weary face. I think the safe house might still be best, Daniel said. At least until we're sure. Right, Marina? Marina nodded. Yes, for a little while, until everything settles. Matthew thought of the safe house's plain walls and uncomfortable couch. He didn't want to go back there, but the idea of going home also felt scary. What if old neighbors were prying, or the media was outside? The safe house, for now, was a necessary limbo. Caldwell gave them a sympathetic smile. All right, let's get you back. You've had a long day, and there's nothing more we need from you tonight. She stood, gathering her files. Thank you again for cooperating. And Matthew, she paused, meeting his gaze. I know it's been hard, but your honesty probably saved lives. Don't forget that. He managed a slight nod, unable to find words. As they were led out of the station, Matthew caught a glimpse of father in a holding cell area through a glass panel. Jonathan sat on a bench, head in his hands, shoulders slumped. For an instant, Matthew's eyes met his father's. The older man gave the smallest nod, as though trying to convey both regret and gratitude. Matthew's chest tightened. Then he walked on, the moment passing like a whispered goodbye. Back at the safe house, the exhaustion was crippling. The tension that had burned them alive all day now left them in a state of emotional ruin. Daniel managed to shuffle them inside, and the officer on duty offered them a tired wave. All of them collapsed into sleep soon after, their dreams haunted by sirens and whispered confessions. The next morning arrived with the promise of new challenges. Newspaper headlines blared about the arrest of a major kingpin, though details were still trickling in. TV stations ran loops of Juliet's transfer, the camera zooming in on her defiant face as officers led her away. But Jonathan was barely mentioned, overshadowed by the bigger story of Juliet's multi-state criminal network. Marina caught the coverage on a small TV in the kitchen, fingers trembling on the remote. They're painting Juliet as a criminal mastermind, she whispered. They barely mention Jonathan. In a weird way, that's good for him. It means the focus isn't all on him. Matthew nodded distantly. It was a strange comfort. Perhaps father would be seen more as a cog in Juliet's machine than a prime culprit. Maybe that would help in court. But it also meant father's own life had been a puppet show, with Juliet pulling the strings. Anger churned in Matthew's gut. That woman had wrecked his family. Yet so had father's own decisions. Daniel stepped in, having finished a call with Caldwell. She says we can visit Jonathan in a couple of days. After the lawyers finish initial paperwork. They'll keep us posted. Marina closed her eyes. That's good. She leaned against the counter, as though her legs might fail her. I keep wondering what happens next. Are we ruined forever? Daniel pursed his lips. We have to pick up the pieces. Jonathan will have a trial, and you might face questions about your involvement. But we'll handle it. You have me and Matthew and... He paused, struggling for optimism. We're still a family in some sense. Family. The word felt fragile to Matthew now, like it could break at the slightest wrong move. But he forced a nod, stepping forward to hug his mother. She melted into his embrace, tears sliding down her cheeks. I'll try to be strong for you, she whispered. The next couple of days passed in a haze of waiting. Legal calls, consultations, the occasional update from Caldwell. Media coverage swelled, digging into Juliet's background, her possible global contacts. The story began revealing more of the laundering ring. Corrupt officials, hidden bank accounts, front businesses. Jonathan's name surfaced here and there, labeled as a key witness in exposing the network. Speculation ran rampant. But the big headline was always Juliet. When the day finally came for them to see Jonathan, Marina's anxiety soared to an almost unmanageable level. She spent most of the morning pacing, adjusting her clothes, brushing her hair, clearly trying to compose herself. Matthew felt his own nerves building. He hadn't seen father since that heartbreaking moment at the police station. Now they'd be face to face in a visitation room, possibly with officers or lawyers present. Would father blame him? Thank him? Cry? He braced himself for any possibility. They arrived at the detention center, a gray, windowless building that reeked of disinfectant and regret. Detective Caldwell met them in the lobby, guiding them through security checks. She reminded them that father was still legally in custody, so no direct contact was allowed. There would be a glass partition. Daniel opted to stay in the waiting area, letting Marina and Matthew go in first. When they entered the visitation room, they saw Jonathan behind a thick panel of reinforced glass, wearing a gray jumpsuit. He looked older, more fragile. Dark circles hung under his eyes. The sight pinched Matthew's heart with both pity and anger. A telephone handset on the wall was how they'd communicate. Marina swallowed hard, picked it up, and motioned for Matthew to do the same. Father mirrored their action on his side, lifting the receiver to his ear. A moment of awkward silence passed, their reflections wavering in the glass. Finally, Jonathan gave a timid smile, though his eyes filled with tears. "You both look okay," he said softly. "Better than me, I'm sure." Marina pressed her lips together. "We're managing," she replied. "I was worried you'd be angry I came that night, after you told me not to bring the police." Her voice shook. "But I couldn't just leave you there." Jonathan nodded, his gaze flicking to Matthew. "I'm not angry. Actually, I'm grateful. If you hadn't shown up, I might have done something terrible. I was ready to run, or maybe worse." Matthew clenched his teeth. "Dad," he whispered, his tone trembling. "I just want to understand why. Why you couldn't trust us to help you before it got this bad." Jonathan's eyes shone with regret. "I didn't want you to see me for who I really was. I felt trapped. Juliet had leverage over me, financial records, contacts, threats against you both. By the time I realized how deep I was, it felt impossible to come clean. So I lied, thinking I could shield you. But I was deluding myself." Marina's hand pressed against the glass, a futile gesture to reach him. "She's in custody now," she said. "It's all coming out. But you'll have to face your part too." He nodded grimly. "I'm ready to cooperate with the authorities. I'm meeting a public defender tomorrow. If my testimony helps bring down the rest of the network, maybe I can get some kind of plea deal. I won't sugarcoat it. I'll be gone for a while, maybe a long while. I'm sorry." Matthew's throat constricted. "We'll visit," he choked. "And when you get out, if you get out, we'll figure something out. Right?" Jonathan placed his free hand on the glass, matching Marina's gesture. "That's all I can hope for. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'll try to earn it." He inhaled sharply, tears slipping down his cheeks. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Marina was about to respond when the guard stepped in, signaling that their time was almost up. The moment felt too short, too rushed, but maybe there would never be enough time to repair the damage done. Before setting the phone down, Jonathan said quietly, "Matt, I'm proud of you. I know it sounds ironic now, but I am. You did what I was too scared to do." Matthew bit his lip, tears blurring his vision. "Dad?" Words failed him. He simply nodded, letting his father see the emotion written on his face. Then he hung up the receiver and stepped away, shoulders trembling. Marina followed, wiping her own tears. They gave Jonathan one last look, a broken man on the other side of the glass, before the guard led them out. Daniel was waiting in the hallway, arms folded. He offered Marina a hug, then ruffled Matthew's hair gently. "How was it?" Marina sniffled. "It could have been worse. At least he's planning to cooperate. That might help his case." Daniel led them outside, where an early autumn sun glinted off the concrete. The day was bright, the sky cloudless, a stark contrast to the grim interior they just left. Matthew took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling torn between relief that he'd seen father and despair at how everything had changed. No matter what happened now, they would never be the same family again. Over the following weeks, life began to settle into a strange new normal. Matthew and Marina eventually left the safe house, returning to their actual home, which felt oddly unfamiliar. Daniel stayed with them at first, helping handle practical matters, paying bills, sorting through letters from lawyers, dealing with the intrusive attention of neighbors who'd heard the rumors. The media was too focused on Juliet's bigger crimes to linger on Jonathan's story for long, so after a brief flurry of gossip, the reporters mostly moved on. A few local news segments did try to get Marina or Matthew's perspective, but they refused interviews. Marina met with lawyers, answering uncomfortable questions about how much she knew and whether she'd helped Jonathan conceal anything. She cooperated fully, providing every scrap of information she had, and eventually, it seemed likely she wouldn't face charges. The authorities recognized she'd been manipulated, that her silence was born of fear. Still, the sense of relief was mixed with guilt. She felt partially responsible, something she might carry forever. Matthew returned to school, grappling with classmates who whispered in hallways about his father's arrest. Some offered pity, others scorn. He tried to block it out, throwing himself into assignments, if only to distract himself. Nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, mind churning with memories of that abandoned factory, the glare of police lights reflecting off father's tear-stained face. He visited Jonathan a few more times, each session a mixture of tenderness and sorrow. They talked through a phone again, Jonathan often asking how Matthew was doing in school, if he was keeping up with sports, or whether he'd made new friends. The normalcy of those questions clashed painfully with the stark reality of where father sat. Nonetheless, each visit felt like progress, a tiny step toward mending trust. Months passed, and eventually Juliet's trial dominated the headlines. She was brought up on a myriad of charges: money laundering, conspiracy, racketeering, and more. Jonathan was called as a witness, testifying to the operations he'd been involved in, the threatening tactics Juliet used, and how far her network reached. His cooperation significantly helped the prosecution, and though he was still facing time, there was a possibility of a reduced sentence. On the day Jonathan was due in court for his own hearing, Matthew and Marina dressed soberly. Daniel drove them, silent but supportive. The courthouse was the same building where Matthew had first spoken those fateful words, exposing the truth he'd overheard. Walking in, he felt a pang of déjà vu, the solemn hush, the echo of footsteps on polished floors, the tense expressions on everyone's faces. They took seats near the back, waiting for Jonathan's turn. The docket was filled with other cases, lesser matters, before the judge finally called Jonathan's name. He was led in wearing a prison uniform. He looked thinner, older, but when he turned and saw Matthew and Marina in the seats, relief flickered in his eyes. The hearing was short and formal. His plea agreement was presented to the judge. Jonathan had provided valuable testimony in Juliet's case and was expected to continue cooperating with subsequent investigations. Because of that, prosecutors recommended a sentence on the lower end of the guidelines, possibly allowing parole in the not-too-distant future. Matthew's heart pounded as the judge reviewed everything. At last, the sentence was handed down, several years in a federal facility, with eligibility for early release if he maintained good behavior. A hush fell over the courtroom, broken only by the shuffle of papers. Jonathan bowed his head, exhaling softly, as though bracing for the reality. He turned briefly toward Matthew and Marina, managing a faint nod, an unspoken gratitude for their presence. They didn't speak to him that day, just watched as he was led away. Marina wept quietly, and Daniel placed a reassuring arm around her. Matthew stared at the empty space where father had been standing. All the anger he once felt had drained away, replaced by a numb acceptance that this was their path now. Maybe one day, father would come home changed, ready to start again. Outside, they lingered on the courthouse steps, each lost in private thoughts. Daniel said gently, "He could be out in a few years if everything goes well." "That's not so long." Marina nodded, wiping her tears. "We'll write to him, call him, visit when we can." She sighed. "Matthew, are you okay?" He took a moment to answer. "I will be," he said softly, surprising himself with how confident he sounded. Then he looked at them both. "We can heal." And so they began the slow process of reclaiming life. Marina continued her job, though she changed departments to avoid the stigma that followed her. Daniel returned to his own life, but he visited often, always ready to help out. Matthew continued school, focusing on extracurricular activities that anchored him to normal teenage life, basketball, a photography club. At first, it felt hollow, but gradually, it helped to have goals and friendships outside the tangle of his family's situation. Letters arrived from Jonathan once he was settled in a facility a few hours away. He apologized over and over, describing new routines behind bars, sometimes sharing small stories about the courses he was taking. Matthew found himself writing back, not every time, but enough to keep a connection alive. He told father about a winning basketball game, a photography exhibition at school, silly jokes his classmates cracked. Reading his father's replies gave him an odd sense of comfort. It wasn't the same as having him at home, but it was something real, something that carried hope. Occasionally, the specter of Juliet's network rose up in the news. Another associate arrested, more hidden accounts uncovered. But with their primary leaders in custody, the group fractured quickly. The authorities declared it one of the largest busts in decades, proud of the progress. For Matthew, it was simply another reminder of how a secret life could ruin so many families. In the quiet hours, he often reflected on that day in court, the day he first spoke up. The shame, the fear, the sense of betrayal. Yet it was also the day his family's biggest lie began to crumble, replaced, slowly, painfully, by an unsteady truth. He couldn't stop the surge of regret that he didn't know everything sooner, that he couldn't save his father from the worst of it. But as the months slipped by, he came to understand a deeper lesson. Sometimes, exposing a wound is the only way to truly heal it. Time did not erase the scars, but it allowed them to breathe. Marina and Matthew found a rhythm in their daily life. Simple breakfasts, shared chores, long talks in the evenings about whatever they wanted, knowing they no longer had to hide anything. When they missed Jonathan, they'd look at old family photos or reread his letters. It was never easy, but each day was a step forward. On a crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after Jonathan's sentencing, Matthew and Marina made the drive to the correctional facility to see him in person for a scheduled visit. The road was lined with gold and red leaves, and sunlight filtered through the branches. A sense of anticipation fluttered in Matthew's stomach. It had been months since they last visited. He'd grown taller, started wearing his hair differently, and he wondered if father would notice. When they arrived, the familiar security checks brought back the unease of that first time. But soon, they were in a visitation area, glass partition again in place. Jonathan entered, wearing prison khakis instead of the jumpsuit, an indication of some privileges he'd earned. He looked at them with something like genuine happiness lighting his eyes. Marina smiled softly, picking up the phone. "Hi," she said, voice tinged with nerves. Jonathan's voice crackled through. "Marina. I've missed you both." He sounded calmer, steadier than before. "You look good," he said to Matthew, eyes brimming with pride. "You're taller, yeah?" Matthew blushed, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "A bit," he admitted. "And you? You look okay too?" For the next half hour, they chatted about little things. Health, school, the status of Jonathan's legal appeals. He told them about a course he was taking to learn a trade, possibly something he could do when he got out. Matthew found tears in his eyes more than once, just from hearing father talk about the future. It wasn't an ideal future, but it was a future. Marina squeezed Matthew's shoulder, and he noticed she, too, was blinking back tears. Maybe there was a fragile peace forming around them, something that could grow if they nurtured it. All too soon, the guards signaled their time was up. Jonathan pressed his hand to the glass. "Stay safe," he said. "Stay together. I love you both." Marina answered in a whisper, "We love you too. Take care of yourself. We'll be back soon." Matthew simply nodded, his throat tight with emotion. As they stood to leave, he managed to speak, voice trembling. "I'll write you, Dad." Jonathan nodded, eyes shining. "I'll be waiting." They stepped outside into the chill autumn air, letting the sun warm their faces. Marina inhaled deeply, then turned to Matthew, a tremor in her voice. I think he's really trying to change." Matthew exhaled slowly. "Me too." He looped an arm around his mother as they walked to the car. The swirl of falling leaves drifted around them, a reminder that seasons pass, bringing change whether one wants it or not. Daniel's sedan was parked across the lot. He'd driven them but stayed outside, giving them family time. Now he waved them over, smiling in that gentle way of his. Once they were settled in the car, Daniel pulled out onto the highway. Marina and Matthew exchanged a glance of cautious optimism. It had been a good visit under the circumstances, and for once they didn't feel crushed by guilt or fear. A comfortable silence filled the car for a while, each lost in their own reflection. Eventually, Daniel broke the stillness. "You know," he said lightly, "there's a roadside diner a few miles ahead. Maybe we can grab a hot meal, celebrate how far we've come?" Marina caught Matthew's eyes in the rearview mirror. She nodded, a small smile curving her lips. "That sounds nice," she said. It was the first time in a long while she'd used that word, nice, without hesitation. Matthew felt a faint spark of hope, a sensation he hadn't truly embraced for ages. They weren't a perfect family. They might never be the same again. But they were still here, still moving forward, still capable of building something new out of the broken pieces. And in that moment, as Daniel guided them down the open road toward an uncertain yet promising tomorrow, Matthew allowed himself to believe that healing was possible.